what I do today, I meet Sebastian Kraska. He's a lawyer and he's an expert when it comes to data privacy. And I know this topic is boring to many of you, but it's super important to keep track of it and to know what you're doing when it comes to data privacy. And I want to try to sum up with him in like 10 minutes what are the most important things you should keep in mind when it comes to cloud and data privacy. So. Christoph Magnussen here, moin. A lot of people, especially in Germany, but over the whole European Union as well, ask like, what about data privacy? They usually say security, which is a totally different topic.
I specialize in data privacy, coming certainly from IT projects like Amiando, but then decided to study law, not going into IT directly. We have a known product called Privacy Kit or Datenschutzkit in German, and that kit allows startups, small companies to also address certain privacy compliance topics like appointing an external data privacy officer, but also going through other topics that you have to be aware of.
So what many companies don't have or don't know, and that's a very helpful thing when you start setting up your data privacy process, you need to list all the tools you have and to see are the contracts data privacy compliant, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, there are a couple of issues that you certainly should have in mind, sort of the 101 basic material that also a privacy authority would expect you to have if case they would audit you. Things like privacy trainings, which you can do web-based via our platform. Things like external vendor management, that you have privacy contacts in place if you're using certain cloud solutions, if you're outsourcing data processing to external vendors. Also to have a sort of a high-level description of the core data flows within your corporation.
And what I always recommend is once you set that up, because some founders say, I don't have the time for that. But there are two reasons. Number one, it can be very expensive. Number two, you're responsible. And number three, if you turn it around to take it positive, I'm always saying, once you have that list, you also list all your tools that you use internally. And you could just add, like we keep it as an Excel file, and we just added, why do we have that tool and how do we work with this tool? So we also use that as a list to keep an overview and to onboard people.
Like, privacy is often taken as something that you have to do because it's the law, sort of. But certainly with some of the aspects that the law triggers there also come some value add for the company. Things like getting transparency on your processes, for example, which then can lead to improvement of those processes once you sort of make transparent on how your data flows are going. Things like also you have a positive message that you can use. If you are privacy compliant, you can tell the client, listen, I'm privacy compliant, so that's a certain level of trust that you're also able to gain with that topic.
We set up a lot of cloud tools, mainly cloud tools, all focus on collaboration. What is your experience when you see a setup like that in terms of data privacy? Do they do everything correctly? Where are the biggest mistakes?
The biggest mistake is probably to not address this at the very beginning of the project. The sooner you are aware of which topics are important to fulfill privacy compliance, the better you are to implement that in your future project. If the rollout has already started and then you start thinking about privacy compliance, that's probably too late, because then it's just depending on coincidences whether the provider is able to fulfill those legal requirements or not. What are those typical requirements? If you're talking about cloud, we're talking about handing over data to an external vendor, to another company that is processing the data on our behalf. And for that legal relationship, it is required to have a controller-processor agreement in place. And with that controller-processor agreement, you as the outsourcing party are staying in legal and technical control on what happens with your data.
Right.
And most of the cloud providers actually provide those controller processor agreement upon request. Some have them integrated into their terms and conditions. Sometimes you have to ask for certain documents. Sometimes they don't provide them at all. So that is something that you should make clear at a very early stage, whether your external vendor is actually complying with that legal requirement to have such an. From a technical perspective, I think you're right. I mean, if you compare what you can do in a small or mid-sized company with regards to IT security, if you compare that to a big corporation that is specialized on providing those services, it's quite clear that the big vendor can do more, can spend more money on IT security, so you actually end up with more secure systems rather than when you do that yourself. And I think it's a trend that we see with many clients, that companies focus with regards to their own IT resources on the real processes that where the company is sort of specialized on, and trying to outsource sort of the one-to-one basic email and sort of basic services, services like Salesforce, etc., sourcing those standardized processes, sourcing those to external vendors.
One thing you wrote me before the interview was that there is some new EU laws coming up in 2018.
That's correct, yeah.
What is that exactly, and how does it affect founders or companies who should deal with that?
We see a huge increase in liability risk. At the moment, the typical fines are amounting to 50,000 euro or 300,000 euro max per breach of the federal privacy law in Germany, and that is going to change up to 2 and 4% of global annual revenue.
Oh, wow.
So you end up with insanely huge numbers, and even if the actual numbers might be slightly lower, like only 1% of global annual revenue, you can imagine that is still a tough increase there. And so to be able to fulfill at least sort of the standard privacy topics is becoming increasingly important, and I think 2017 is a good year to prepare your organization to come up to speed, to not be surprised then in 2018.
One question that definitely some of you watching have is, what is the future of data privacy in combination with cloud? Because there's most likely no way around a cloud setup in your company within the next 5 to 10 years. Every company has to go in sort of cloud service. Right,
yeah. I think the answer is sort of two-sided. One is IT security is becoming increasingly important, also under the mentioned EU General Data Protection Regulation. So to have secure systems in place is becoming more and more important. So going to the most secure cloud provider is certainly sort of helping you to address that liability issue also under the upcoming EU General Data Protection Regulation. On the other hand, if you look at sort of the legal side of that topic, having those controller processor agreements in place is important, and which set of contracts to choose is depending on whether the data resides in Europe or whether we have a globalized cloud provider who would like to store the data all across the globe. And that is partially also an economical question that is currently debated, especially between the EU and the US, on how regulation should look like and how we should sort of behave with each other to a certain extent. I think we see a certain tendency on the European side to say that the data shall reside in Europe with the European entity of the cloud-based provider, and then the cloud-based provider sort of adding remote access to the data globally. I think that is, to some extent, quite likely set up that we will end up with on a midterm basis, and that is certainly something where the cloud providers are preparing for and that they are monitoring quite closely to then add their products in the way that local law demands. So we will end up with privacy-compliant cloud solutions there. The underlying message is there will be ways to make those privacy products, those cloud products, privacy-compliant. It's only important to have that on the list, to have those agreements in place and to monitor the developments in that area. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the visit.
Yeah.
Enjoy Munich.
Thanks for the insights.
Thanks.